Hello, welcome to Gardener's World. Rhubarb is one of those seasonal fruits that I absolutely love. But when you're harvesting it, don't cut, you pull it. And you'll feel it come away. You've got a little bit of the base attached to it. That can be cleaned off before you eat it. And from the base, you should get new shoots. If you cut it, there is a risk of dieback and a bit of disease getting in. These can be harvested regularly throughout spring and early summer, but stop once you get to July. Let the plant grow, let the leaves get really big, and all that goodness that they take through photosynthesis will feed back into the roots and ensure a good harvest the following year. And if you want to lift it and divide it, the time to do that is when it's dormant, ideally in the new year. And make sure that it's mulched well, it has a good feed. This is a hungry plant, and it will go on giving for years to come. Now, coming up in today's programme, Francis meets a couple who have transformed a long, thin garden into one that is rich with wildlife, flowers, and lots of delicious food.
Did you do this on purpose, where you had chard that matched your dahlias?
No, that was a complete accident.
That's definitely an accident.
It's a very happy accident, because they're perfectly matched, aren't they?
Nick visits Bodmin Garden in Wales to see how the team are regenerating the garden and landscape after devastating storm damage.
Any space like this is in a glorious state of constant evolution. So in fact, those losses provide some fantastic opportunities.
Dr. Amir Khan celebrates the therapeutic effects of gardening.
Just watching nature will be lowering my blood pressure, calming my heart rate, having that soothing effect that I need after a busy day at the surgery.
And I shall be pruning back my pelargoniums and fuchsias and taking cuttings from the material so I have a really good summer display. This was full of winter salads, but they're now over and they were going to seed, and it'll be another 3 months or so before I plant out my tomatoes. So I want to use this slot to grow some early salad leaves that will grow fast. For example, rocket. This grows best in spring and again in autumn. And what we try and do is plant some indoors and some outdoors, and the indoor crop will grow much faster. And I grow them in plugs, and you can see the roots, which means that it's ready for planting. And if the roots are wrapped around the plug, then that's no good, that's too late. There's usually about a 2-week window when these are perfect to plant. If you are planting outside, having grown these on, or you can buy plants in plugs from garden centres, give them a bit of protection. We can still get a lot of cold weather. A cloche is ideal. Fleece over the top, that will help. It'll all just bring them on, because what we want is fast growth. You can see that I've spaced these quite wide apart, because that will encourage a better root system. And if you have a good root system, A, you'll get more leaves, and B, you'll have healthier plants. I'll water these in well and keep them well watered. Rocket responds well to lots of moisture. And the key to making the most of your ground, it doesn't matter if you've got a big greenhouse or just one container or a patch outside, is to plan ahead. While you're planting one thing, sow another, and then there'll be succession. And that way you will have maximum harvest. Now, this is pretty utilitarian, and that's fine. But you can grow vegetables so they look beautiful. And Francis went down to Frome in Somerset and visited the garden of a young couple who've created a beautiful garden with lots of delicious food.
I've had my fair share of gardening against the odds on my allotment, all with the aim of creating something wonderfully productive. So I can't wait to see how Katie and Matt have created a beautiful kitchen garden, which they like to call their potager.
Katie and Matt, product designers by day, are relative novices to gardening, but they've poured their creative spirit into carefully observing and developing this very special garden over the last 2 years.
How big is the actual space?
I think it's about 45 metres by 5 metres.
Yeah, so it's a very long, kind of thin garden.
Yeah. So what were you trying to create with this garden?
We kind of wanted to create a space that encapsulated all our kind of inspirations that we take, and an area for, like a potager, an area for vegetables and ornamentals, an area for wildlife, and then also an area for sort of seasonality and a place to experiment with planting throughout the year, fitting a lot into a small space.
I was going to say that is a lot to fit in. So how did you approach that? How did you tackle it?
We just decided to kind of do it in sections so we didn't get too overwhelmed.
It's a really effective design, really, for a long, thin garden, isn't it? Just to break it up and create a journey that leads you through so you don't see everything all at once.
Yeah, it definitely adds like an element of surprise to the garden.
How long has it taken you? How long have you been here?
We've been here about 2 years now, I think, yeah.
Yeah, we kind of worked on the garden for about 18 months.
Yeah, so the first year we kind of didn't do too much and sort of looked at the garden and where the light lands and just kind of surveying it, and then we sort of started after about 6 months, didn't we?
So how did you actually approach building this garden?
Because there was a shortage of supplies and things, we kind of did it maybe the opposite way round, and instead of being able to put in the boundaries and things, we had to put the plants in place and then do the boundaries afterwards. So it's maybe not the most orthodox way of doing it, but it kind of worked for us in a way.
Well, that's the total opposite way from how you learn to garden, isn't it? You know, all your hard landscaping goes down, then the plants. But actually, plant-led design is a really lovely way of doing it, and clearly it's worked.
Hopefully, yeah.
Definitely.
Yes.
So what are we planting here, Matt?
So we're planting some biennial foxgloves that we sowed earlier on this year. So they're the seeds we saved, like these ones actually here.
I love that dirty pink colour, it's stunning. Hopefully these will come true to the parent.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
And this is your seasonal interest section.
Yeah, so the idea that me and Katie came up with was to kind of make a garden that had sort of seasonal interest all year round.
And is that because you see it most from the house? You want to actually have something to look at all year?
Basically. So, like, particularly in sort of January and February when it's quite dark and grey outside, it's really nice to have some things to look at when you come out, and it kind of pulls you out into the garden, which is really nice.
Yeah, completely. And clearly, I can see just from the range of plants that you have, you're working with quite different conditions. So this is presumably very shady. Yeah,
so this virtually gets no sun really in the day, and so we've gone with a lot of things like lots of different kinds of varieties of ferns, which work really, really well. And amongst the foxgloves, just the nice textured leaves and things, it works really well, yeah.
And then sunny on this side.
Yeah, so we've kind of picked plants that kind of work really well with our kind of modern British summer, with the drought-tolerant kind of plants like the Perovskia and things like that. So, and also it just gives you some amazing colour that go really well with the grasses.
I really like how you've cleverly used colour, like the euphorbia with the persicaria and the astilbe and that beautiful geranium.
Oh, yeah, that's lovely.
And even the flower of the heuchera with the purple foliage. This is a really lovely cohesive colour scheme, but then it's picked up by things like the echinacea. So it ties in, even though you have a riot of colour there and a more muted palette here.
Oh, thank you.
In the next area, they've created a wildlife pond, complete with their own viewing platform to observe what turns up at the mini beach. But as I move through the garden, it's the different ways they've divided up the space which I especially love.
There's a mature hawthorn near the house, and they've carried on that native hedging at this far end with some field maple, some cornus, some elder, more hawthorn, and some of that will provide food for them, but also food for wildlife. So they've thought about wildlife all the way through the space. There's also lots of timber, so there's a beautiful hazel hurdling fence here. This division here is a lovely natural wooden fence. And then on the other side of the garden, there's some quite modern fencing, again, just made out of wood, with horizontal slats that give a really contemporary feel. It gives a sense of seclusion for Matt and Katie when they're in the garden, and very clearly marks where each space ends and then the next one begins. And it really works. Finally, I get to see the area I've been really excited about, the potager. Since the Middle Ages, people have grown flowers alongside their veg as a means of pest control. But the French really took this to heart. They created gardens that celebrated the beauty of veg mixed in with flowers, and they called this the jardin potager, which simply means the garden that provides vegetables for the pot. So Matt, what was your kind of vision for this area?
Well, we wanted a place that we could sort of grow ornamentals and vegetables and everything all together in a really beautiful setting, basically. Because we'd like to grow organically using companion planting and things to kind of really get the most out of the vegetables.
How do you tackle crop rotation?
We've divided the garden up into 4 beds, the potager, so then we obviously have the different groups and families, and then we move them around every year and rotate them, so then we don't deplete the nutrients in the soil. And then also just kind of the symmetry as well of having the centre point and then having the 4 key beds where we could then interplant beautiful flowers amongst the vegetables as well, so it kind of looks balanced.
Well, I think that veg are beautiful, just as they are, but there are also lots of flowers too. So are they cutting flowers, or are they companion plants, or a combination of both?
It is a mixture, so we've got a lot of dahlias in the bed just behind you, and then we have quite a lot of marigolds and nasturtiums as well, which is sort of more of a companion planting, but then obviously they're edible as well, so you can use them in like baking and salads.
Do you have any things that have worked particularly well?
Well, courgettes are a success every year. We always have way too many courgettes.
This year I think our squashes haven't done so well because we try and pack so much into a small space.
Yeah.
Sometimes things do shelter other things and they might not get enough sunlight, so we do have to kind of remember that every year and make sure we reposition things a bit and stuff, so yeah.
Well, I had the same thing actually, but this year I've grown my squash vertically and that seems to be working quite well.
That's a good idea.
This chard is looking amazing. I love the colours. Did you do this on purpose, where you had chard that matched your dahlias?
No, that was a complete accident.
That's definitely an accident.
It's a very happy accident, because they're perfectly matched, aren't they?
Yeah, they actually are, yeah. I've never noticed that before.
It's wonderful seeing what they've created here. What could be a more perfect way to spend the day than a morning coffee in the seasonal garden, lunch with the wildlife, and a piece of cake in the potager at the end of the day?
Although I love the content of the garden, what I really admire is what Katie and Matt have done with the design of the garden. Because by breaking a long, thin garden up into different areas, in fact, you make the garden seem much bigger, and it's a trick that always works. I've got a job to do here in the jewel garden, which is timely, because this is the perfect moment to be moving, dividing, or even planting herbaceous perennials. And you know that moment has arrived when you start to see a flush of new growth. Now what we have here is Rudbeckia. This is Rudbeckia laciniata. It grows about 6-7 foot tall, flowers for months at the end of summer, a really good plant. But you can see I've got 2 rings. There's one here, which is quite large, and another smaller one there. And that's a good example of how herbaceous perennials grow, because they grow outwards and they form a kind of donut. In this case, the growth in the middle has completely died back. So you have this empty space in the middle and these satellite plants. So what I need to do is dig these up, replant 1 or 2 generous clumps back in the original place where I wanted them, and that will leave me a good half a dozen decent-sized clumps of Rudbeckia to spread around the jewel garden. Now when it comes to digging them up, it's just a question of getting in there and chopping through the plant. Out you come. You can see that is a really good clump. There we go. So straight away, I've got 3 really healthy clumps of Rudbeckia. Now, if I wanted to subdivide this, when you've got solid roots like this, the best way to do it is with a sharp spade, just cut through them. just go down and cut. And there you are. And you can see that although I've cut through the root, that won't harm it at all. That will grow perfectly well. And if you really, really want to produce lots of plants, even that, if you pot it up, grow it on, you could plant it out next spring, and in time that too will make a decent sized clump. Before I plant each of those in a new position, I'm going to plant a good sized clump in the original spot where I did have the Rebecca. So we will take the soil from there and use it to refill the hole that I've created. That can then go in there like that. That will grow away perfectly well. All I need to do to give it a kick start is just water it, and you'll hardly know that it's been moved. And in about 3 or 4 years' time, I should lift it, divide it, and keep that process going. Now, I'm going to dig up all these other ones and move them, but while I'm doing that, it's time to go to the first of your gardens this week. And this is in Leicestershire, and it's filled with one of my own favourite plants.
I'm Patty Henning, here in Dysworth. We've been here 25 years. People have been planting here for so long. You're absolutely covered in flowers any time of the year. What this garden means to me, in the morning I make morning tea for us and I come straight out here early morning. It's generally a noisy time, the birds are up and flying around and it's just lovely. It builds me up for the day. I would say it is the biggest contributor to my mental well-being. We'll walk around the garden and all your troubles seem to slowly go away. My favourite has always been the primula. I think it's perfect. So, dug up this big clump of primroses. I'm going to split them and then pot them up and get them looking healthy and then finding a new home for all of them. Using the little fork, dividing them and pulling them apart. They're very healthy plants. There he goes. I could sit here and do this all day. This is my idea of perfect afternoon.
Well, I'm with Patty. I love primulas, but best of all, I love the common primrose, Primula vulgaris. But there's nothing vulgar about it. It's just beautiful. Always delicate and simple, and for me, full of hope. Now, primroses are very much a flower of spring. But last summer, we went to Lincolnshire to visit Jonathan Shepherd, because he has the only national collection of one of those flowers that are the stars of high summertime, the hollyhock.
I think hollyhocks bring me a lot of happiness because they're tall, colourful, cottage garden plant that the bees absolutely love. It's amazing when you walk through a drift of hollyhocks just to see how many bees that are in and out of them. There's a history to some of these plants that are quite fascinating. Charles Darwin was interested in hollyhocks and how they reproduced. You've got some of their varieties have been grown in the gardens of some of the first American presidents. You can come here when the light's at its best, late afternoon into evening during the summer, and there's a light breeze, they're swaying in the wind, the blooms are out, it's a multitude of colours. It's just a true joy. Well, I've always been interested in gardening, and we were lucky enough to buy this 2-acre plot in Lincolnshire. And then I've always been interested in growing hollyhocks as well. And I had a chance encounter with people at Plant Heritage at Hampton Court and noticed that there was no national collection. So you fast forward, I guess, a year and a half onwards, and here we are with a national plant collection. And they're a challenging plant to grow. And I think that when people tell me they can't grow hollyhocks, that was a challenge to me to actually grow it and set up a collection, because, you know, with that challenge comes a great reward. And it's bringing a flower that perhaps people have seen as old-fashioned, you know, back into the limelight and hopefully back into their garden. And I'm still just the same guy doing what I used to, which was growing plants that I like. But with the National Collection, it's all about then labelling it and ensuring that that variety comes true and it's still in existence. The payback in terms of protecting a species is invaluable. The whole collection has been grown from seed. To keep the collection almost in perpetuity, it's all about isolating the flowers and keeping the bees away from cross-pollinating them, so in the hope that that seed comes as true to the parent as possible. They're easy to germinate. They've got almost a husk around them, and the individual seed is actually inside each one of those discs, so the actual hollyhock seed is actually quite small. Yeah, I sow my hollyhock seeds in 7cm pots. I give them a water, I put them in my polytunnel, but a greenhouse or cold frame would be equally acceptable. And then as soon as the last frosts have passed, you can plant the small plants outside in situ. One of the issues with hollyhocks, it has got to be wind. Once it's in bloom, it almost acts as a bit of a kite. So the best thing to do is get a stake in there, tie it up, fingers crossed that you don't get gales, because even the best growers, if it's too windy, some of them are going to snap, and you've got to accept that when you've got a plant that's so tall. The logistics can be described as a bit of a faff. We're not going to go on holiday until October because obviously, you know, I've got plants in the ground and it's a national collection now. I initially sowed the seeds in 7cm pots, and the idea was to plant them directly in the ground in these 1 metre square beds. That sounded all well and good until the blackbirds started pulling them up. The moles pushed them up when they were planted, and we have a very healthy rabbit population living locally. So as a last minute think on your feet plan B, I bought 100 of these 90-litre bins. Each one's had to have 10 holes drilled in, filled them with my own homemade wood chip, put on top some peat-free compost and planted them in there, and that was absolutely ideal. Now, because lots of them are growing in these black bins, they need to be watered. That's not a 10-minute job, that's more like a 2-hour job every other day. I've got a watering system here on the plot. I've fixed these water tanks to the house that collect rainwater. By the end of winter, I've got just over 20,000 litres. It's amazing how quickly that water dissipates. Just going to show you a hollyhock, a self-seeded one that's currently suffering from rust at the moment. So as you can see, this has got lots of disfigured, ugly leaves. It doesn't look very well. Rust, without a doubt, with regards to hollyhocks, is an issue. It's airborne, there's still no cure. We first heard about it in this country, I think in Victorian times, where it was called the scourge, and it puts a lot of people off growing them. So what I always advise is you pull off any infected material, you collect it, you collect any that's on the ground, and you don't compost it. You dispose of that infected foliage by putting it in your council garden bin. Learn to live with it almost as a disease. So think about where you plant it. So if you've got a small garden, plant it at the back of your plot and underplant it with something like a dahlia, so that even when the foliage gets disfigured, you can take it off and you don't see the bottom part of the plant. You still get to benefit from the amazing colours and the amazing blooms. If I was a newbie gardener to hollyhock, the first port of call is buy a packet of seeds. That if you've got a bare patch of earth, for example, you could just literally broadcast the seeds, leave them, and without a shadow of a doubt, I believe you'd get hollyhocks. My suggestion would be to get probably 3 different sorts so you can have what I would call the full hollyhock experience. I'd suggest growing a double, a variety such as Peaches and Dreams, something like that. I think that when they're grown, they look as good as any peony on the market. I'd suggest, I think, something quite different, something like a Niagara, which is a black hollyhock, one of the blackest plants in flower that I've seen. It's been around for years and years. This is one of my favourites. This is Alcia Halo Peach, which, as you can see, has just huge blooms. It's a more modern bred variety. It's one of the Halo series. It's a little bit more compact than some of the more bigger ones, so it might be more suitable for a little bit smaller garden. So when you look at this as a national collection, it's very much what I would call almost in its infancy. You know, this is now going to be almost a lifetime of learning more about it, finding more about it, finding out new varieties and expanding on what's already been done. This time last year, there wasn't a national collection here. They're a majestic plant. Why wouldn't you want to grow this?
Like Jonathan, I love hollyhocks, and when I was a child and there was chalky soil in our Hampshire home, they grew really well. They loved it, but they don't grow well at Longmeadow. They don't like our heavy clay and just wet climate. So I'm looking for alternatives. In fact, what I'm sowing here now is some antirrhinums, some snapdragons, which obviously are different, but it's one of those principles that find a plant that you want to grow and it wants to grow in your garden. And then the chances of success are much higher. And snapdragons grow really well here. This is Royal Bride, a lovely white one, which will look great in the writing garden. Sow it now, and it should be flowering later in the summer. And there are a whole other range of perennials and annuals you can grow that have the same impact, say, as hollyhocks. Phylloxerums, for example, love this garden. They really thrive in our heavy, rather wet soil. When it comes to annuals, if you want drama, the same sort of height and impact the hollyhocks give you, you can't do better than Nicotiana sylvestris. I always grow that. It's really happy here. Lovely white dreadlocks of flower, some of the best fragrance you'll ever get. And you can sow those now, and they will flower later in summer. And the same technique for all of them. Sprinkle seed thinly, cover them lightly, water them, and then put them somewhere warm to germinate. And in my case, that will be a greenhouse, but a windowsill will do the job just as well. Some of them, like the antirrhinums, will flower this year. Some other perennials may have to just develop this year and then flower next. But it's a great way to increase your stock of plants that want to be in your garden. Now, still to come on today's programme. Nick visits Bodmin Garden in North Wales to see some of the devastating winter storm damage the team there now have to cope with.
This Sequoia sempervirens was a champion tree at over 50 metres tall.
So it was the biggest in the UK?
Yeah, and to see that just lying on the ground, just absolutely devastating.
And Dr. Amir Khan shows us around his own garden, which is his prescription for better mental and physical health.
I know just standing here out in the garden, that's doing me wonders. You know, we have evolved over millennia to spend time in nature, and it makes sense that our physiological functions have evolved alongside nature as well.
I keep my pelargoniums and fuchsias in the greenhouse or cold frames over winter, and they're kept cool but frost-free and critically dry, and they go dormant and rest. However, now we're coming into spring, you can see with the pelargoniums and the fuchsias, we've got new growth coming through. The trouble is, with both these plants, the new growth inhibits growth lower down on the plant, and they gradually get more and more leggy. That's particularly true of pelargoniums. You can see you've got all this bare growth at the base, and this year's new growth, which is up here at the top, will shade that out even more, so they get more and more leggy. And the same will apply to fuchsias. So if you want a plant with lots of fresh growth and lots of flowers, then you do need to cut them back. Now I'm going right back to here. You can see you've got these new shoots at the base of the plant. Now if I cut that there, the result will be a bushy plant. Now, I'm not going to throw that away. And then this side here, plenty of growth underneath. We'll just cut there. Now this new growth makes really good cuttings. And in fact, for the best display and most flowers, if you have all your pelargoniums grown from cuttings each year and just keep the older plants as mother plants to supply cut material, that will regenerate it and give you the best possible display. Now, when you're taking cuttings of any kind, you do need a free draining compost. I've got some pots here and I've added lots of perlite. Perlite is great for cuttings. You can use sand, you can use grit, but the great thing about perlite is that not only does it improve drainage, but it also holds some moisture. Right, that's all ready. So let's just take that off there. Now that's too big for a cutting. If you have too much leaf, that means it will lose more moisture. The chances of that surviving long enough to develop new roots are very low, so we're going to reduce it down. I'm going to take off these leaves like that, and those like that. I'm just going to cut at that point there, and then we can just pop this in there like that. Now there is just one thing to remember about pelargonium cuttings that is different from most others. And that is, although they need moisture around the base of the plant, where they form roots, they rot very easily if they have too much moisture around the top, around the foliage. So you don't put them in a mist propagator, for example. You don't wrap them in a polythene bag, and you don't really need to spray them in any way. Just make sure that the compost doesn't dry out, and they will quickly develop roots. And you'll know they develop roots because you'll see new growth. So put these somewhere warm, not on a south-facing windowsill because that's too bright and too hot. And in about 2 to 3 weeks, you'll see signs of growth, and then you can lift them and pot them on and grow them on as new plants. With fuchsia cuttings, which in principle will be the same, they do need moisture around the leaves. And the easiest way to do that is simply buy yourself a mister and just mist them. Now, I think everybody in the country had to cope with storms at some point throughout last winter. And here at Longmeadow, I remember one weekend we had 3 separate storms. But the damage was surprisingly mild. We seemed to get away with it. But in Bodnant Garden in North Wales, they really did suffer. And Nick went to visit them to see how they are managing the aftermath of those storms.
Situated in a spectacular setting on the foothills of the Snowdonia Mountains lies Bodnant Garden. A Grade 1 listed site spanning 80 acres, it's famed worldwide for its national collections of exotic species sourced by 19th century plant hunters. The garden is also home to the largest collection of champion trees in Wales. In other words, the biggest of their species. Some are up to 250 years old and have thrived for generations in this perfect growing environment. But lately, some of these giants have fallen victim to a significant event which has created a trail of destruction behind it. Back in November 2021, Storm Arwen ripped through the north of the UK. With gusts of around 70 miles per hour, it caused extensive damage to parts of this site. Along with staff and volunteers, head gardener Adam Salvin has been dealing with the aftermath. Adam, I guess most UK gardeners are aware of the fact that the bulk of our winds are coming from the southwest, and so we protect around that. But actually, what's struck the garden here is a very strong northeasterly, right?
Yeah, that's right. For us, it's a really unique sort of direction because of the way that the wind can whistle up the valley that we've got in the dell. So it's hit somewhere where it's not used to normally being hit. And then the damage that we've suffered is very extensive. And yeah, there was a lot of very shocked and saddened gardeners that have been quite attached to some of these trees. When we came down to this area after the storm, truly amazing to see the destruction that had been caused in that several hours of wind. This Sequoia sempervirens was a champion tree at over 50 metres tall.
So it was the biggest in the UK?
Yeah, and to see that just, as it sees now, just lying in that state of total rest now at peace on the ground, just absolutely devastating for the team to see. And then the domino effect of all the other trees that it's affected.
I mean, looking at this, the scale of both the tree and the root plate are just extraordinary. And I think what probably surprised most gardeners is that on the other side of that root plate, there isn't some giant taproot, is there? It's just, you know, what is it, 18 inches of root that's been holding this thing for 140 years?
Yeah, and I think it is surprising to all, and I think this one just shows that it's probably the thinnest root plate that we've got. Some of the other pines are a little bit deeper. This one on the banks of the river, really shallow. But we think there's about 15 tons of weight in there. It's 7 metres tall. It's just huge.
So potentially the tree has kind of evolved to its environment in as much as it's kind of put maybe a thicker root plate down on the southwesterly side where it's traditionally getting that big impact. And then suddenly the wind completely changes direction and the tree's just not prepared for it.
Yeah, just not used to that direction. And I think here, my thinking around this one in particular is also with the river and it being a rock base of the river, here the roots would generally be going in that southwesterly, westerly direction. And when that northeasterlies come, it's got less roots on the riverside. So it's sort of compounded it as well as that sort of geographic thing. It's actually the topography of what's here.
There are some positives to the loss of wooded areas such as this. Species which would have struggled in the past under these heavy canopies, such as annuals, bulbs and shrubs, are suddenly able to thrive. Also, the fact that large logs, trunks and whole pieces of tree are left on the ground to rot down makes fantastic provision for wildlife. So there's food for insects, which then, of course, go on to feed the birds. So it's not all doom and gloom. Bodnant's precious botanical collection is renowned for its hybrid plants. Currently, horticulturalists on site are doing everything they can to salvage those that were hit by the storm.
We've got rhododendrons, we've got magnolias, we've got acers, and these are really important to Bodnant's collection. So what we're able to do when we've been skillfully trying to cut and pull out the big timber with excavators, we've then been able to take out in places some of the plants that we've been finding as and when we've been discovering things that are there that are small enough to just to take out and heal in these storage beds. So we're able to label where they've come from, what they are.
And I'm aware a lot of these sort of smooth stem rhododendrons are really difficult to propagate, you know, if you want to return them to the garden. How have you addressed that?
In some cases, we've sent around about 30 plants off for micropropagation because of that difficulty getting them to propagate from normal methods.
So normally I guess it would be cutting or layering, but micropropagation is literally taking tiny, tiny segments of leaf and growing it on agar jelly, right?
Yeah, could be some years before we know of success rates, but where we've only got 1 or 2 of those plants, it's well worth doing just to try and safeguard the significant collection that we've got.
Is there any advice you'd give to home gardeners on sort of mitigating the impact of, you know, future extreme winds and storms and the like?
In the past, we might have looked at staking things quite high. Now, I think it's known to be a lot better to use a shorter staking method. It helps to strengthen the stems of the trees, helps to strengthen the root systems, which can only be a good thing in terms of getting them to get that good start and that's good stability to hopefully combat storm our winds.
The garden has suffered some significant losses, but of course, any space like this is in a glorious state of constant evolution. So in fact, those losses provide some fantastic opportunities.
I do know, just as Nick says, that however dramatic and catastrophic storm damage like that might appear, it creates opportunities for change that would never otherwise happen. And by the way, when you're staking a tree using a short stake, what that means is a stake about 3 foot long, preferably at an angle of 45 degrees to the tree, into the prevailing wind, and then remove it after 2 years. I've got some Ami. This is Ami majus here for the writing garden. The writing garden, if you're not familiar with it, is based upon the lovely white exuberant froth of cow parsley on a perfect May day. Now that's a very fleeting moment. So what I'm trying to do is make it last for as long as possible. And Ami is the most wonderful umbellifer. It has all the virtues of cow parsley, starts flowering a bit later, and goes on flowering for a long time, about 6 weeks. It's an annual, and I sowed this last September, almost treating it like a biannual. It's one of those annuals that needs a long growing period. There is just one problem with Ami. It's a wonderful plant and I love it, we'll always grow it. However, I'm not the only thing that loves it, because rabbits adore Ami majus, particularly at this time of year when there isn't much else to eat. So if you've got rabbits in your garden, I would hold back. But once the grass starts to grow, i.e. it starts to warm up and the nights get a little bit warmer, then there's no problem, they leave them alone. However, what I'm going to do is plant a dozen or so out now, hold the rest back, and then in a couple of weeks' time I'll plant those, and that should be a security measure. Now it's time to visit the second of your gardens this week. It belongs to Clinos Mary Jehu.
Hello and welcome to our front garden in Mask by the Sea in North Yorkshire. It's a very open garden, which is lovely for meeting people as they go past and having a chat. But it's also a bit of stress at times, especially keeping the front lawn tidy. After Christmas, we completely covered it up, and then in March we lifted all the turfs and dug out the weeds, including dandelions that seem to go down to Australia. We, or rather Roger, is currently in the process of planting 270 of these little things. They're creeping thyme, and they will gradually spread across the entire lawn area. You can see our thyme lawn has grown into a very colourful, thick, lush and very bee-friendly area. We have a good amount of clover, which we and the bees seem very, very happy with. There's a fair amount of euphorbia. I don't really know whether the bees like it, but I do, so that can stay. And finally, of course, we've still got the odd dandelion coming up. We know that the bees like them with their bright yellow flowers, but that's something we're just going to have to agree to disagree on, and they're definitely coming out, if I can get it. So all these months on, I've got to say that it possibly hasn't been less work than regularly mowing our lawn, but it's been far more fun. It's something we definitely recommend to other people to have a go. It's been great.
It's interesting what Clinos Mary was saying about the upkeep of her thyme lawn, but they are lovely and a really good idea. The one thing I'd say about thyme is that you must have free draining soil and full sunshine. And if you have that, then it's beautiful and will work. If you don't have that, it's not even worth trying. I'm just finishing up pruning the last of my roses. Roses can be pruned any time between autumn and sort of mid-spring. But whenever you prune roses, don't be frightened of them. They're tough. This is called Madame Hardy with wonderful white flowers. And you want to prune to maximise the flowers. So the first thing to do is to remove any dead growth. And so here, I've got a bit of dead growth there, we'll take that off. Right, the next thing to do is to remove any branches that are noticeably crossing or rubbing. Now these two, for example, are crossing and they're going to rub and that will cause a wound and that's where you can get possible infection. And one of these has to go. I think for the moment, I'm going to reduce this one back. I'm going to take it right back down to there. And then you take off any really weak growth. I've got a weak growth coming off that, so we'll take that back and here. Next thing to do is open it out a little bit, so if it's crowded, and the whole thing can be reduced by about half. If I can see a bud, I go above it, but don't be precious about it. Now that's still a little bit crowded, so what we'll do is that I'm going to take out there, just to free a bit of room in the middle. And here, I'm going to take this one out like that too. So finishing pruning your roses is something you do want to get on with. Just cut them back, let plenty of light and air in, and you'll have a mass of flowers this summer. Now, last summer, we went to visit the garden of Dr. Amir Khan in Leeds, who, as well as being a very busy general practitioner in the city, is also a very keen gardener.
Gardens for me are a respite from our busy lives. However big or small your personal oasis might be, you can get all sorts of psychological and physical health benefits from just being outdoors amongst the plants and in nature. My name's Dr. Amir Khan. Even though we're not too far from a busy main road, the sounds of the garden are really just filling the air. We've got insects buzzing around, and I love that sound. It really gives you that whole essence of midsummer. And finding some of the plants that are coming out now, like the malva and the meadow rue, and we've still got some foxgloves going. As well as that, I can hear the birds. That is wonderful. There's a crow, and normally I have bullfinches and a very noisy wren and a very territorial robin. I know just standing here out in the garden, that's doing me wonders. You know, we have evolved over millennia to spend time in nature, and it makes sense that our physiological functions have evolved alongside nature as well. My full-time job is as a general practitioner, but gardening is a passion of mine, and this garden does keep me busy. And I've gone in hard on wildlife gardening. The plants I've put in attract a multitude of insects, including bees and wasps and hoverflies and butterflies. We've dug out a pond which already has families of frogs living in, and we've caught newts as well, which has just been fantastic. We're really lucky. We've got a couple of hedgehog houses which are occupied by hedgehogs, and they give us a lot of joy in the evening times. And when we're sitting out here, it is lovely because we see red kites flying overhead. In the evenings, we'll get bats. But my favourite thing of all is attracting birds. So I am filling up my bird feeders, and I have lots of them. Now, I'm really lucky. I get a lot of birds in my garden, but it does mean they go through a lot of food. So I have to buy in bulk, and it's not uncommon for me to have to fill these feeders up twice a day. It's like a full-time job, really, in itself. They come, they eat, and then they want more. Going back to the science of it, just watching nature, looking at images of nature will be lowering my blood pressure, calming my heart rate, having that soothing effect that I need after a busy day at the surgery. Everyone can benefit from spending time outdoors in nature. Just me sitting here, I am breathing in chemicals given off by these plants called phytoncides. They are natural antibacterial, antifungal chemicals. They're giving off all the time. I'm breathing them in, and as I do, my immune system is responding to them. I will produce white blood cells called natural killer cells, and they have a really important role in fighting off viruses and even reducing my risk of developing cancers. Spending time in green spaces has massive benefit to our physical and mental health, and the NHS is now capitalising that by using green prescribing. Now what that means, for me, rather than prescribing pills or a course of treatment for a particular ailment, I may ask my patients to actually spend time in their gardens, in their local park, perhaps even at the beach, so they can get the benefits of nature on their illness. Last year, when the pandemic hit, I was seeing people with respiratory symptoms, including COVID, in what we would call red hub sites. And we only had minimal PPE, we didn't have means to test people at that point, and I was very worried about not only getting the virus, but bringing the virus back here home to my family and what it might do to them. And that was a real cause of stress for me, and I was spending long hours in these red hubs, seeing these patients. So coming home, the first thing I would do, I'd come out into the garden and just sit here just for a few minutes, maybe tend to the plants and just centre myself and bring my anxiety levels down. The other thing I was doing was planting a lot of these pots that you see here, and that again took my mind off things. It gave me something to do that felt meaningful, that felt important, but felt far away from what I was doing at the surgery. It was an important part of me getting through a really tough part of my career. It's great to see lots of hospitals making space for hospital gardens because patients and staff can benefit from them. Studies have shown patients who are recovering from surgery, who have views to gardens and green spaces, recover faster and on average leave hospital a day earlier than patients who may not have such views, which would save the NHS a whole host of money. My favourite thing to do in the garden is just to sit in it and watch the wildlife, because I've put so much effort into making it as wildlife friendly as possible. Just being in the garden is great, but I'll be honest as well, I feel like I might have a secret plant buying addiction, and so I've now been banned from buying any more plants for the garden because apparently it's fit to bursting, which I don't agree with, but I'm on strict orders. There is still a lot of people out there who don't have access to gardens and green spaces, be it because they're socially, economically deprived, or it may be because they don't feel represented in such places, particularly people from minority backgrounds. I work at an inner city practice and I see firsthand how difficult life can be for people who are socially deprived, whether that's single mums, elderly people, just people on low income. The problem is accessibility, asking them to get 2 buses and a train out to a national park is difficult for them. It's impossible for them to do at the end of a busy working day. So we need to bring those green spaces to them so they can get the health benefits that I'm getting right now from being out here in nature. This garden for me has been a real saviour, particularly over the last 18 months. And I talk about it with my patients so they too can get those benefits. My prescription to everyone watching this today really is to spend more time in your garden or your local green space.
The more I garden, the more I agree with what Dr. Amir Khan is saying, that the real benefits of gardening, the real purpose of gardening even, is the well-being that it gives you physically and mentally. Now, I'm digging these celery plants up, and they're destined for the compost heap because celery is not truly hardy. You'll see that there's a certain amount of new growth inside, but it won't be that good. It'll be slightly bitter, and the moment has passed. But the important thing at this time of year is to prepare the ground. And this bed has been part of the carrot family this year. So In terms of rotation, I will either grow potatoes or legumes in it, and that means it needs manure. So I want to clear the crops, dig it over, and then add some compost, and that will be ready for planting when the soil warms up, which will be in a matter of weeks if the weather is kind. Although I'm taking out the celery, I'm not removing everything, because, for example, the chard, although it looks a little bit weathered over a long winter, is actually still perfectly good. And beetroot, even if it's woody, is good for juicing. And the new leaves from the beets are delicious eaten raw in a salad. But celery, I think, can't be reclaimed. Now, this is keeping me busy. So while I'm doing this, here are some jobs for you this weekend. Sage is a Mediterranean herb that wants to become a very woody shrub unless you cut it back hard. And now is the right time to do it. Be brave and go back as low as you possibly can, but leaving some signs of growth. Then it will very quickly develop new leaves that will be delicious in the kitchen. If you grow strawberries, now is the time to give them some attention after a long winter. Cut back any dead growth and remove any faded or old leaves. And then mulch them, preferably using garden compost or a good quality soil improver. This should set them up for summer. If you haven't done so already, you should definitely be cutting back autumn fruiting raspberries. These produce their fruit from August through till November on this year's growth. So all last year's shoots can be cut down to the ground. Mine are very young plants, so there isn't a lot to cut back, but on established plants, this will mean removing quite a lot of shoots. I've taken these primulas from the writing garden. They're a cross between primroses and cowslips, and they've self-hybridized. And they do tend to pop up all over the garden. The trouble is they've popped up in the wrong place. The colour scheme in the writing garden is white, whereas here on the mound, it's pale yellow. So I'm relocating them where they will be more at home. Now that's it for this week. Next Friday, we are back at the slightly later time of 8:30. And don't forget that on Sunday morning, the clocks go forward, which means that we gardeners get an extra hour outside. Marvellous. So I'll see you next Friday. Bye-bye.